Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. For those of you in Melbourne, it's really tough right now. We're in stage 4 lockdown, and I know for many it's really difficult to find time to relax, to self-care, to work, to look after family. And for those who are doing it all from home, that's also really difficult, having one space be so many things. I just wanted to let people know that it's okay not to be okay right now, to have some self-compassion and some empathy for just how difficult this is, all the change, all the kind of mental fatigue and decision fatigue that comes with having to constantly adapt to new things. I'm sure we'll get through this together, and my thoughts go out to everybody. This episode comes a little later than normal. I took some time off to self-care, to rest and recuperate. And so we're a little bit behind schedule, but all good. This week's episode, I chat with Jo and Alice, and you might remember them from a previous episode late last year where we looked at their journey from students to starting a social work magazine. I think we've clarified it now as being called a periodical, but nevertheless, Social Work Talks Quarterly is written by Jo and Alice. They combine interviews from a number of different social workers in the field, share their experiences, have other people write guest articles, a whole bunch of really great stuff. They talked to me in this interview about their previous edition, which was all around mental health, and their upcoming edition, which is due to be launched very soon. So check them out on Facebook. I'll put some links in the show notes if you like what they write and you want to get involved. Maybe get in contact with them. I hope you enjoy my episode with Jo and Alice, the first returning guests on the Inside Social Work podcast. Okay, welcome back. For the first time, I'm having a return guests on the podcast. So welcome back, Alice and Jo.
Hello.
So when we first spoke was probably last year. You just sort of had a few issues down of your Social Work Talks Quarterly. How's it going? Where are you at now?
Good. Surprisingly good. We've just been chipping away, and we've had a recent issue for mental health is what we looked at, and some really interesting conversations we had there. We've got another one coming up as well, but it was just so good to see how responsive everybody was, especially for us, because we planned back in February. Then with COVID-19, it was a bit uncertain about how is this going to happen, and will people have time, and just adjusting to a different way of living. But everybody was still pretty helpful, and we were still able to get through and talk to who we wanted to talk to, and then still get it out in time for people to read. So it was good.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Jo, but I've really found the people we talk to are just incredible. Like, they're out of this world. Like, you know, I'm a really 2-year out social worker, and I'm talking to people like Sonia Taskin and Charlotte Tesweri. And I just think to myself, like, how did we get to this point where these people, they're sharing these incredible stories, and their core values of like decolonising and reframing education and thinking through mental health in a much more holistic perspective, which is really all that social work's about. And we get to share that story with people. And I think, that's just been a really lovely uptick of this year, I think, given everything that's happened.
I agree. I'm always amazed because you know how it is, like, you know, reach out to people that I don't know in different states. Sometimes I forget about the time zone difference, which hasn't caused too much issue. But you know, like when we had the mental health issue and we spoke to Pauline Connolly in South Australia, and I think the story part of it makes it more accessible for people, because that research that she was doing, it was on vicarious trauma, and that's a pretty like hard topic to get into, but I think it was just having it as that conversation made it a little bit easier to actually access and talk about. I'm always excited.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, for every social worker, the reason we get into social work is kind of what keeps you going in social work. We all have those experiences or those core values or even, and I think that what's really been lovely is talking to people who aren't your typical white social worker female, and hearing their stories, you know, how Charlotte experienced incredible like cultural genocide growing up, and how she's like reframing who she is as a social worker so she can be like the forefront of decolonisation. That story is more important in some ways than, you know, a graph that shows the work she's done, because that story frames what she's doing. And I think that's been really lovely to be able to share those stories.
If we rewind back to when you first started, what did you like? How did you picture the journey going? Like, what were you hoping to achieve when you first started the newsletter?
I mean, we didn't think it would go like this, that's for sure.
What does that mean?
I think when we initially spoke about it, we're just like, I think we're both pretty idealistic, optimistic people. And so we just like have these ideas like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we did this and talked about this? And like, even with the, you know, decolonizing social work, like I find that they're big topics and it can be hard for me to approach as well. So initially what we, you know, talked about and what it's evolved into, where it's these amazing people who are, you know, sometimes the forefront of the field that they're in or the area that they're in, and then they give us time in their busy schedule to, you know, share these experiences and their knowledge. I don't know, I just didn't expect people to respond.
Yeah, I think when we started this magazine, it was Joe's baby, and it was really an opportunity for our class to have a network once we left university. So we could just keep in contact of where people were at. You're looking for a new job, check out this person, they're working in this organisation. And then, yeah, now it's spanned to, hey, actually look at what this great person is doing, and all of these social workers in Australia and even internationally. We have a few people from the UK and the America checking us out. Yeah, being like, hey, this is what people are doing and you need to tune in because it's going to change your practice. I think that's been really exciting.
How has it changed your practice? So the upcoming issue will be number 8.
Yeah.
What have you learned?
Number 7. Oh, yeah, sorry, number 8. You're
number
right.
8, the next one. Yeah. So what would be some of the learnings that you've taken for yourself, and how has that shaped your practice?
For me, I'm working in child protection, like on a project I've just finished. So I'm still studying. So even though I'm still part student, I don't feel like I'm fully immersed in practice yet. But I think for me, it's really been just expanding my understanding of what social work is, but what it can be. I find that when I've gone through a study, the expectation or understanding is going to be, we're going to go all into child protection and sort of work in statutory agencies. And whilst a lot of people do that, I find that just having these conversations with people from all different specialties within social work really just expands. Like when I sort of feel a little bit like, I don't know, it just expands, I guess, the opportunities that I feel like that are available. And sometimes I catch myself as well. Like, so looking at the moment, I'm looking through a lot of records for carers for DCJ, which is the Statutory Child Protection Agency in New South Wales, and just looking through some of the, you know, records that like the casework notes and stuff like that. Just the language that's being used, and then seeing how it's changed from like the 70s to the 90s to now. And then it's also reminding me that, oh, there's times when I'm talking with somebody and they can, if they've worked in the department before, it's almost like PTSD for them, because that language is like re-alerting them to when they've had that experience with the department. So it's, yeah, just sort of catching myself out and just always trying not to be complacent in the place that I'm at with social work. If any of that made any sense.
Yeah, it did, Joe. It's interesting to hear those reflections. Alex?
Yeah, I think I work in foster care and out-of-home care in New South Wales as well. I work for an NGO, and I've really been on a journey to understanding the importance that Indigenous people place on culture. Particularly in DCJ at the moment and going through the courts, there is a huge emphasis on kinship and this sense of like, there's been situations where you see horrific things have happened to a child and a magistrate will still decide to place them back with that family because of culture. And coming from a very white Anglo background, that's been like, yeah, it's done my head in. I'm like, how can we put this child back in danger? But really, like, through the conversations I've been having with Charlotte and with Sonia and with Jim Ife as well, who's someone I've like worked with through Social Work Talk, I've really been on this journey to kind of understand just how huge Western knowledges are in social work. And I think this is something Joe and I come back to. We studied at Western Sydney University, and there's a really big emphasis placed on like recognizing, identifying, and really deconstructing these Western knowledges. But I think as a really young social work in what is a really fast-paced, very distressing at times, often you feel like there's more paperwork than sense. And it's just been really grounding to come back to that sense of like, you are privileged. You operate in a Western knowledge that privileges your skin color and your experiences. And every time you feel overwhelmed, you need to come back to that reality because otherwise you will drown. And I think that's been just so helpful through all the conversations I've been having. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you both talk about those experiences. And a lot of the guests, when we talk about what's kept them feeling connected to their work or what's helped get them through, a lot of them talk about just connecting with other social workers and staying in the loop with either mentors or just peer groups. Hearing you both reflect on some of those conversations you've had for the newsletter, for the magazine, it makes me think that's what comes out of having those networks. You're able to reflect on those things, because I know for most people, I mean, most of my friends who are social workers, their family aren't, or their partners aren't, or their friends are, friends from high school who've got different careers. And that's great. I mean, I'm not saying you have to only have a social worker friends, but there's different conversations you can have when you reflect on your practice with other people who are in the same field.
Yeah. I definitely find that, like, if I'm a bummer at a party, that's telling me I need to go talk to my social work friends. Like someone will bring Black Lives Matter up and I'm like really deep diving into how we can be deconstructing the way that we like oppress Black people. And people are like, I just wanted to say that I posted a hashtag. Like, it's a Saturday night, man. And I'm like, oh gosh, I've got to get back to those social worker friends because they get it, they understand.
I get that. No, I get that response too. But I think it's also having that conversation or those conversations with so many different people, because a lot of us, do have partners that aren't in social work. You have to sort of, because we are able to reflect so much on those conversations that we've had, you recognize that your audience is not just going to pick up and understand those words that you use straight away. So I find, even though we're in social work, it really isn't just limited. Anybody that's living and interacting with other people is going to be touched by social work. And I think that's something that I find, because my partner's not in social work at all, but I can still have a conversation with him. He usually walks away having a bit of a headache, but I'm just like, we need to have the conversation, because there's a lot of things that are left unsaid. And when they're left unsaid for a long time, people don't question it or people don't think about it because it's not spoken about. So I think, it can be difficult sometimes when you're that person at the party, but it's just, I find that because when we're able to talk to these people, it's conversational. That for me makes things make more sense and they're more in context than if I'm just reading a straight out, I don't know, research article or journal article. I feel like sometimes it's really disconnected. And in this upcoming issue, the one after the one that we have on the one we have on education, I was able to speak with Maggie Walters. So basically anybody that's done social research will know that textbook that her name is on. And she's done a lot of work. So she's, really well known for doing quantitative research. And I never, really thought too much about it, but it was just really interesting to have the conversation of her research journey. So she's a Palawa woman, so from Tasmania, and just her talking about her research journey and how she didn't even finish like year 12, but then she went on to do a PhD, and then she's done this, and she was, did her honors, didn't know what an honors was, but she did really well. and just understanding that story, and then seeing how it also like tracked with the progression of how she changed the way that she put out, you know, like those textbooks on research methods. So one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I asked her about, you know, for example, they're in the 4th edition now for the social research methods, and there's an extra section about different people's research journeys and approaches. And I was just sort of asking her in that conversation, you know, when we do frontline work, there's a lot of cultural awareness training and stuff, but how does that work in textbooks or in teaching that stuff? And, you know, she said something which I thought was really interesting, because initially she said, when you sort of go in and if you apply for like an identified position where it's, you know, specific for an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, it gets to a point where you just sort of get pigeonholed and that's all that you can do, and it can sort of ruin your career. So she said the way that she would sort of present that information and the way that she has included that information about cultural awareness was indirect. So instead of just straight out saying like, all of this information, she spoke and included information about your standpoint and how the methodology all goes into your research, you know, the approach, the perspective, your religious affiliation, how all those things feed into the research that you do. So in that way, it was highlighting that you have to be aware of those, you know, like the privileges you have or don't have and how that might be coming into the research. So yeah, I just thought it was a very interesting conversation. When I went back and listened to it, there were many like amazing pieces of just life knowledge that I couldn't completely comprehend during the conversation. But yeah,
I can't wait to read that. If we take a step back, so we're recording this a couple of weeks probably before your next issue comes out. So this will be a good challenge. Can you remember the titles or the topics of your last 7 issues? And then we can kind of maybe recap your last one around mental health and talk about what's coming up. Or do I have to go back to your website and have a look?
We might have to go back to our website.
They're all on the Facebook at Social Work Talk Quarterly. The first relaunch issue that we did, which was in October last year, that was the one where we really sort of changed the format of how we did Social Work Talk. So it switched to, instead of just being that cohort of Masters of Social Work students at Western Sydney, it was involving those other people and just people who are involved in social work. And that was focused on community. And then I think the one that we had after that was decolonizing social work, which that was a really interesting one. That's when we had a PhD candidate, Charlotte. So that was a really interesting story because she's from Uganda, but then studied in like Sweden and
now she's in Parramatta of all places,
making up her own methodology, as you do in a PhD. Not really, but. So then, yeah, there was decolonising social work, and then we had the May issue this year for mental health in social work, and then this upcoming one is on social work education. And then the one after that will be on language, which I think will be interesting and follow on well from social work education.
Definitely.
So for those who are interested in learning more, we'll put links to the Facebook group in the show notes, but just a shout out. So it's, if you just kind of search in Facebook, Social Work Talk Quarterly, it'll come up.
Yep, that's it.
So if we go back to the May edition, what are some of the key things that you reflect on in the mental health, and how did you choose the topic? Maybe that's a good place to start, is how did the topics kind of come up?
Alice and I laughed so much about this. So we actually planned in Feb of this year. And when we do this, so that was our yearly plan where we just decided, okay, what are the topics that we're going to do? But because we're planning so far in advance, we never really know how it's going to land when it comes out. But luckily, somehow the universe just sets it out. And it just seemed to be, we had planned to have the mental health issue for May. And with COVID hitting, it just seemed to fit really well with what was happening in the world. So
the same happened with decolonisation, where I interviewed Charlotte for our community episode, and afterwards, and afterwards I called Joe and I was like, Joe, this needs to be its whole thing. Like, this needs to be decolonisation. And we released it pretty much around Australia Day. And that wasn't on purpose. That just was good timing, really. I think we often talk to our guests, and our guests are what reframe what we're actually going to reflect on, or we have a particular idea in mind, and then, you talk to a guest and you just think, oh my goodness, my mind is blown. I need to rethink how we're going to put this issue out. And I think with mental health for us, it was important to reflect on it as the AASW's mental health social work is kind of like taking on its own thing. And I think a really big question for us is like, why social work? Like, there are many people who, you got psychologists and psychiatrists, there's counselors, like all of these people dabble in mental health or spend a lot of their time in mental health. So what is it about social workers that poise us to do mental health differently? I think basically the time it takes to become a mental health social worker, you would probably be just as good doing a psychology degree. So like, what makes us different and what poises us to address it in a different way? I think that was kind of really what we were wanting to explore with our guests. But I think there was another thing for us that we felt really frustrated by with COVID, and that was a lot of organisations putting the onus on social workers to be well. And, the kinds of work we do, often, not always, but often it's really hard to be well, because at the end of the day, you are messing around with people's lives. You're in the mess with them. You're experiencing their grief with them. You experience their joys with them. And then you're supposed to go home and pretend like it didn't happen. And so for us, we really wanted to talk about what is it that organisations can be doing for their social workers? Because if as social workers, we're thinking holistically and systemically, our organisations need to be doing the same. And so that was also kind of like another area that we were looking at.
Yeah, and also with just doing social work, when you go through uni, you do learn a lot about systems theories and how systems impact on the individual. And so I just thought it was really interesting that, for a lot of people, for example, who are on that front line doing that work and being exposed, well, obviously it's going to be implications. So if we can understand that for that, marginalized individual, the system might be working against it. It's also like, okay, well, actually, as a social worker, I'm within this system itself, which is, whatever it is, whether you're working for a state agency or not. So then how can that system help support me, to keep it sustainable? Because I just think sometimes it's, like Alice said, there's a lot of the onus is put onto that individual. And I just thought that it was a little bit ironic that we can see clients in that perspective being influenced by the system, but then at the same time, we've got to realize, well, we're sort of in that position as well. We just might not consider ourselves at that same level. So that was where that talk with Pauline Connolly of Centacare, so she's based in Adelaide, just on vicarious trauma. So that was a study that they put out last year. And they were looking at vicarious trauma and how that's different to burnout or compassion fatigue. And they were looking at it specific for their organization and just, and it's not just the frontline employees as well. So they also included, for example, the admin or reception staff, because they could be the first point of contact. And the thing is, when you think about it, they might not even have that level of training to deal with trauma, and they're just answering the phone and being sort of bombarded with all this information. So that was really interesting. And it was good also because we were able to talk with Jonathan Louth, who's based at he's at the University of South Australia in the Australian Alliance for Social Enterprise. And they did the research, and it was also good to talk with him so that he could give sort of like a brief synopsis of this is actually what we looked at, because otherwise the actual study itself is about 50, 60 pages, which was a bit of bedtime reading for me.
I think this is what we wanted to do is we saw a great organisation like Centacare who was putting their social workers' mental health and wellbeing first. And they weren't just doing it like lip service. They actually were like, we need research. Like if we're evidence-based practice for our clients, we need to be evidence-based practice for our employees. And I think Jo did a really great job of highlighting the great things they've done. And actually for my own organisation, I sent them our article and was like, to my principal officer, here we are. What do you think? And in her newsletters that have been going out in COVID, we're seeing her starting to implement some of the same conversations and same language. And I think that's been really lovely to see. That other organisations are taking note from Centre Care.
I do like the quote that you'd put in the article about Pauline sort of saying, you know, you've got the picture of her saying, you know, for heads of department to give themselves permission to ask, you know, how are our workers going, it then kind of makes them responsible. You know, so she sort of says, you know, that actually makes us very vulnerable to ask that question, because when we ask it and we get the answer, then we have a responsibility to do something about it. And that's such a powerful statement.
I wasn't prepared for that answer at all. I thought she was going to give me a completely different answer.
What did you ask? What was that an answer to?
I think I was just asking about how that, it's testing my memory, but I think the question was something along the lines of, with this research, how do you think other organizations can learn from it or apply it to their organization? So I was thinking she was going to talk about, oh yeah, this organization could implement like this type of supervision model or something like that. And so when she said that, I was like, oh wow, this is like stepping it way back, like starting from like square one, basically saying you're allowed to look at this. So when she said that, I was just thinking, I wasn't even prepared for that answer, but I thought it was really impactful what she said, because she's talking from that position where she would have come across that herself. And I'm pretty sure that there'd be a lot of other NGOs who would also be feeling that way, because then she was talking about, you know, sometimes you don't want to have to ask the question because it is right. You then have to possibly do something about it. And then does it mean that there's a liability? And then there's all of that talk and everything in relation to that somehow the organization is liable. And so I just thought it was, really a basic starting point, but it's very foundational.
And I think, one of the episodes earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember, we talked about sort of the staff burnout, and, you know, it wouldn't be surprising if in the next however many years it's recognized as, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there was almost a class action. Like, we know that this has been happening. And I think you're right. Some people are scared to ask because then they have to do something about it. But by not asking and ignoring it, it's happening anyway, and it's so much worse.
Yeah, and I think we know that when we work with co-workers who say things to us like, I don't know if I can do this job anymore. Like, you know, there's that is a regular conversation that comes up. And, you know, I have those thoughts too sometimes. The work we do is often hard. But I think it's very different to have that conversation with your supervisor, knowing that they'll hear you and that the organisation will respond, as opposed to, you know, talking about it at lunchtime with your colleagues and everyone saying, me too. I think there's something really powerful about being heard and then having people respond appropriately. And that's what we do for our clients. And it's only fair, I think, that our organisations do that for us.
So there's a lot of stuff in your mental health article, because you not only just look at the topic, but from a variety of perspectives, which I think is a very different take on it than perhaps even the title might give it credit for, because you're looking at staff, at clients, at the accreditation process, at people's experience, like the role of social workers in mental health. Like, there's so many different angles that you look at it from.
Well, we try and keep it interesting. I think that's part of the change when we did sort of switch the formatting, is because there are so many interesting stories, but it's not just the interesting bit. There's a lot of things that we're unfamiliar with, because, for example, with mental health, it might only be a certain focus on it, that these other things sort of, get left unsaid. But the way that it came together, I think it was just, mental health can be, there's a lot that comes into mental health. And it is a big thing to try to narrow down to, you know, a couple of pages. I thought an important thing, and Alice and I both discussed it, was just somehow getting the AASW to have some sort of message of support, because a lot of social workers aren't members. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't have some message of support from that body. And they were receptive enough when I did reach out to them that they were happy to. So Christine Craig, she's, I think, the national manager, or the
President?
Yeah, the president. Sorry, I can't remember her exact title, but it was really, I think, important for social workers to see that somebody at that level is giving these words of support. Um, so I thought that was really important to start off with, because like you were saying before with COVID-19, it stresses people in a way that isn't necessarily known. When I was having that conversation with Pauline, she did say that there were staff members, especially counselors, who were finding it more stressful working from home because they couldn't have that silence that you would in a face-to-face interaction. So there was a bit of a pressure to always fill in the gap and not have that space. And then she also linked that to how there were changing practices around the way social work is done. So, you know, if you're having that, say, one-on-one session, you're not like leaning into the client and mirroring them, because now it's like you don't want to have mirror, say, the reaction that their nervous system is having, because you in a way that's sort of how you have that vicarious trauma. So it was interesting in that conversation itself to see how when she was a social worker, and how that's changed, and the practices then have changed till now, but it still takes time for the change to occur, like from that research point of view, and then have it actually filtrate into the way practice is practiced.
And I think for me as well, the way social work does mental health is, if you're a social worker, you do mental health. You might not be trained for it. You might not really be aware that you're doing it, but anytime you come in contact with a person who experiences some level of oppression, you are doing mental health. And I think it was important for us that, and this is something that Lucinda, one of the clinical workers, she also works in an out-of-home care agency, but kind of more at that clinical level rather than your typical frontline worker. Yeah, that was her thing. She was like, we need to be talking about mental health, and we need to be looking at it from all these different angles, because it's not like psychology where there's a very set idea and understanding of how you get from point A to point B, in terms of this is where you start, there's a treatment, and then hopefully that person either has the coping strategies or the skills. You're just in the mess, and sometimes there's no way out, and it feels that way. And, you know, you've got housing as an issue, you've got food poverty as an issue, you've got period poverty as an issue, and that, you know, point A to point B with some kind of treatment in the middle is not the solution. And I think that's kind of what we wanted to show with this, that there is so many different ways to look at mental health and to address mental health. And actually that we are, a puzzle piece of mental health. We're not just professionals looking in, we are professionals looking out as well.
Well, we all have mental health, and I think that's where the word can kind of be stigmatized. It's just like physical health, and every day we wake up feeling good or not so good or better than yesterday, or we have mental health in the same capacity. And I think we maybe don't understand that as well, of, you know, our connections, our stresses in life, like so many things impact that, just like physical health can change day to day. So the mental health issue has heaps in it. So if people want to check that out, there's a good kind of nearly 20 pages of stuff. So some really awesome interviews there. Tell us about what's coming up in the next episode, in the next episode, that's me, in the next newsletter, in the magazine. Do you prefer magazine or newsletter?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I call it a periodical.
Periodical. All right. What's happening in the next periodical?
So we are going to be focusing on social work education, and it's got some interesting conversations. So I've been able to speak with Maggie Walter, like I was saying before. So she's edited the social research methods textbook, which every social work student would have come across. So that was a really interesting conversation. So really it was just talking about her work. So she's done social work, but also sociology. She's also worked for the public service. This is in Tasmania. And she just talks about how that has impacted on her social research. So she's a Palawa woman from Tasmania, and that was a huge, it was like the first question after I'd sort of just done the acknowledgement to country, and she just said, well, basically we don't have any more elders anymore because of genocide in Tasmania. And so that just blew my hat off. So it was just interesting, because then that was how it sort of framed her research journey. And so how, decolonizing social work research and how that's then played out in the books that she puts out. She's also been really involved in the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. So it's about collecting data in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but not from a deficit view, but data that's going to contribute to help create the future and the present that they want and they should have access to. So it was a really interesting perspective on that, because she said that basically in a lot of the research that she's done, a lot of the conferences that she goes to, she would get frustrated because it was the same deficit approach. So if that's the only statistics that you have, then the implications for programs and the policies always going to be similar. But yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. Alice will be able to speak with a really interesting academic at our uni, Western Sydney.
I'm going to be interviewing Sonia Taxon tomorrow. Taxon? Hang on, let me start that again. Taskin, sorry. I will be starting a conversation with Sonia Taskin tomorrow. She is a fantastic woman that Jo and she really framed for us what it meant to be a social worker when we were studying. She and her husband have written a book called Disrupting Whiteness in Social Work. All of the conversations and really the journey I've been on to understand my own whiteness and my own really privilege as a social worker has been through her and her husband Jim. And I'm just really excited to talk to her. She has really interesting ways of doing education. I think Sonia in particular, she is not happy with an essay. That's not good enough for her. She wants reflection. She wants something Jo and I did when we were studying was we had to make a video talking about basically positioning ourselves in relation to Indigenous work and Indigenous experience. And I just think that's what we need in social work is more of that work. It's going to be a very exciting conversation. You'll hear more about that when you read it.
And I just wanted to say, Sonia was... her way of assessing was very different. So that video essay, there was a lot of resistance as well, because a lot of people were saying, I don't know how to use this software. But that was sort of the point of it, that when you go into social work, you're going to be put into situations where you're going to have to figure out on the spot how to deal with this. So yeah, she's very inspiring. And actually, after sitting through a couple of her classes, and I don't know if it was because it was on a Saturday morning, but basically the idea for the periodical came out of doing her classes, because I just thought, that just makes sense for us to be doing something now and trying to connect each other rather than sort of waiting till we're at the end of it and everybody goes their different ways. So I'm looking forward to it as well.
I'm sure she'll be glad to hear that her different way of teaching has inspired people to kind of do new things and create something where it didn't exist before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what we need in education. We need to be decolonising and disrupting education and social work, but we also need to be thinking about what are we trying to achieve in our social workers, and is writing an essay that's been well referenced the way to check that they're doing okay and that they're going to be the social workers we want.
I agree. I mean, I think that's part of the motivations behind the podcast as well, is it's an ongoing learning. I think for a lot of professions, maybe they don't have the same identity with their profession as we do as social workers. And I think you're right when we're talking about, anybody you come in contact with will overlap with something we deal with in social work, because we're talking about the whole human condition and systems and families and networks and policy and politics and the environment. Everything has an impact on how we integrate. And so you kind of stand a degree. I mean, I don't think that's enough. I think that's just the bare minimum. You need to step into the world of social work. Mm-hmm. And then that's that ongoing process of connecting with your peers, supervision, reading books or journal articles or podcasts or, newsletters. Like, it's that ongoing learning of where you also fit in relation to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as the longer I've been in social work, the more I realized that my degree was just a starting point. you know, like when you think about accountancy, you learn to use Excel, you learn like what the laws are, and every now and again things change. But with social work, who you are as a person should fundamentally change because you are a social worker. And I think, yeah, like thinking back to mental health, that's a huge thing. We talk about boundaries, and in a lot of ways, how do you put a boundary up between who you are as a person in your job, if that's a large part of our identity, and the work we do? You can't. It is one and the same in a lot of ways. And so I think, yeah, that's why I'm really excited to talk to Sonia tomorrow, because I think she'll have some really interesting points of view on that.
Great. Well, we'll look forward. So when does that issue come out?
It'll come out end of August, probably around the 24th of August, which is like a Monday. It sort of just depends, given that the interviews go well and everybody's sort of tracking on time. That's the roundabout date it'll come out.
So end of August, we'll go with that. Just before spring, the last winter edition.
Yeah, if you like us on Facebook, you'll see a couple of the different guests we've got coming up. We'll be posting a little bit, so you'll get the notification that when it comes out.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast again.
Thank you for having us.
Hopefully we can do this a bit more regularly to align with your quarterly periodical.
Yeah.
That's just what I call it. Magazine's probably easier. Who knows? I'm sure it's going to evolve into something else.
Don't confuse me. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode's resources, and don't forget to click subscribe and review us wherever it is you get your podcast.